Everybody. My name is Professor Greg Evans, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of ISTEP, the Institute for Studies in Transdisciplinary Engineering Education and Practice. I'm also the director of SOCAR, which is the Southern Ontario Centre for Atmospheric Aerosol Research. ISTEP does work on engineering education. SOCAR does work on air quality, climate, and sustainability. So it's my distinct pleasure to be able to moderate a panel that brings those two together. In fact, I would say it's more like a life dream to be able to talk about how these two are so interconnected. So what we're going to do today is we're going to collectively examine one question, and we're going to be looking for input from all of you. We're going to be recording the chat that we collect. We have Quillian, who is at the front here, who is going to be looking at the chat and synthesizing that. And we have Danny and Isaac. Where are Danny and Isaac? They're there. Okay, they're up there. They have microphones to go around. So we're going to talk for approximately the first half to set the stage. And then it's going to be a question and answer, because we're really looking at your input on the future of engineering education, and more specifically, how we should educate engineers for the 21st century who are well equipped to deal with sustainability. So specifically, we're going to look at this way we should change the way we educate engineers and how we can help them deal with these incredible challenges of sustainability. We're going to break it down into three parts: what we teach, how we teach, and who we teach. And each one of us is going to deal with that. Now, that's way too much for me, so I've invited these other distinguished panelists to help with this. So fortunately, we have with us Professor Susan McCahan. You want to put up your hand, Susan? There's Susan. And she is the Vice-Provost Academic, and more importantly, the Vice-Provost Innovation in Undergraduate Education. So she spends a lot of time looking at how we teach, and so she's going to talk a bit about the how. We have Wilson-Ihejirika, close, who is a graduate student. She's a PhD student in our collaborative specialization in engineering education, and she's going to look at the who we teach. And we don't have with us today Daryl Wilson, who is in Spain, or he may be on a flight back. So he is the executive director, I have to get that title right, of the Hydrogen Council, and he has been busy touring Europe. As you can imagine, with the energy situation in Europe, hydrogen has suddenly increased in profile just in the last few months. He's told me he's never seen so much interest in hydrogen since the war against Ukraine has started. So he's over there. Unfortunately, he won't be able to join us, but he did send us a video, and he's going to be looking at what we can teach from his experience as an alumnus from our faculty who has, as you'll hear, worked in a huge range of different industries. So before I pass it over to the other panelists, I want to give a bit of an administrative setup. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk about for the first half, and then we're going to pass it over to you for question and answer. But even before that, I'm going to be asking the panelists some questions, and I'd really appreciate that if you join in on the chat. So if you have a device with you and you log into the website, you can contribute to the chat, because we're also looking for your input on your answers for these questions. You can also put questions in, and Quillian is going to synthesize those so that can be part of our discussion together. And for those of us joining in person, Danny and Isaac have microphones that they can pass around, so we'll use that for the question and answer. So let me set the stage by introducing three themes. I'm going to talk about how education for sustainability should be different. I'll talk about transdisciplinary competencies, and I'll explain what those are and why they're an important part of sustainability. And then I'm going to talk about learning itself as the absolute key competency for sustainability. So I'll get into those and I'll pass it over. First of all, why is sustainability different? Well, we know sustainability is different in terms of the scale, the scope, the complexity of the challenges. It's also to do with the pace of change that's going on and the need for us to be able to learn quickly because of that. We know it's interdisciplinary, but I'm going to talk more about it being transdisciplinary, and I'll explain what that means. And what it means is we're going to have a need for what I call T-shaped students, engineers who have the technical depth, but also have the enabling breadth, those who can put our ideas into action. So let me talk the second point, this idea of transdisciplinary competencies. So transdisciplinarity is a strange word for some, and I first ran into it because of my work in sustainability. That's where it's more common. You can think about it in terms of Venn diagrams, because that's about the depth of my mathematical thinking. So you can have the idea of people working in a multidisciplinary team where each one has their circle. We have somebody mechanical, electrical, chemical, and they're each doing their thing, and they're working with each other. The circles don't really intersect. The second is interdisciplinary, where the circles intersect and we start to pick up on the expertise of each other. Transdisciplinary, you might imagine, is having a circle around the entire area to try to create something new, something that's overarching, but more importantly, something that brings in human relations, perspectives, and values. We talk about transdisciplinary competencies, and these are the ones that are essential for enabling things to happen. These are competencies such as communication, teamwork, leadership, entrepreneurship, the ones that involve interacting with people, and they're absolutely essential for sustainability because often it is the human interaction parts that create or enable the sustainable change to happen. The last one I'll talk a bit about is learning as a competency. We've talked about the learning economy. This is a change from the knowledge economy. It used to be that people who know more, companies that know more are more successful. Now it's going to be companies and individuals who can learn more quickly are going to be the most successful. So learning how to learn is absolutely key, particularly when the pace of change due to sustainability is picking up. We look at the learning process. So the learning process, as those of you who are students hopefully understand, it's about receiving information but then processing it and making connections. So it's taking something you observe, something you hear, connecting it to something you already know to build a mental map. And the idea is that if you have a strong foundation of something like engineering, that allows you to make connections more quickly and more easily, and hence you learn more rapidly. So having this foundation in something like engineering sets you up for learning, but you still have to learn across your lifetime. And lastly, to connect it back to the idea of sustainability is the idea of learning while doing, because the pace of change is going to be, or need to be, so rapid over the next decade. We're going to have to learn as we go. We're going to have to be agile as we go. We're going to have to be able to take the observations and learn how to do it better next time. There simply isn't time left to strive for perfection, come up with the ideal plan, and then implement it. We've just got to get on with it. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Professor Susan McCahan, who will talk a bit about the how we educate and how we should educate for sustainability.
Thanks very much, Greg. So when I was asked to be on this panel, I started thinking about the first time I was teaching on topics of sustainability. And I think that was probably about, well, now 30 years ago, when I was teaching a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning course that included aspects of sustainability and energy use. But perhaps a little more recently, 20 years ago, I was teaching a seminar on climate change for students. And interestingly, this was for first-year students. They had a set of readings they did. They came in, they talked about the readings, they discussed concepts, they put them down on paper. And the final question of the seminar was, how do we get people to change their attitudes, behaviors, and practices around the realization of what we need to do to prevent this from happening in the world. And almost to a one, my students always said, well, we just need to educate people. We just need to teach them. If they knew, they would change their behavior. If they knew, they would wrap this into their practices. And unfortunately, the sad fact in the literature is that study after study has shown that actually educating people about climate change has fairly little impact on their practices and behavior. And part of that is not because people are not absorbing the information. It's because information in and of itself is not sufficient to actually, as Greg said, that part of processing where you actually take what you learn in a classroom and transfer it into practice. It takes way more than knowing something. And so how do we teach to actually have impact? And there's a number of strategies in the literature on teaching and learning that suggest ways to approach this. And these include things like situated learning. So situated learning theory and the work that has gone into that says that you actually learn something in a more impactful and effective way, which means you value it, when it's actually taught in a real life situation and context, rather than just in theory. And so the more we can bring things like understanding around sustainability into experiential learning, for example, into PEY positions, but when it's actually situated across the curriculum and where students are actually getting that feedback on the things they are doing, right down to the ways in which they are drawing, you know, free body diagrams and so on. And finally, one of the key parts of how we need to learn going into the future is making sure the students learn how to learn not only in a formal classroom, but informally and online. Because their professional development in all fields, including in understanding the sort of the latest strategies and models around, concrete models around what they can do within their own practice to bring sustainability into their field of work, which inevitably is going to be different than a field that they may have learned about it in a classroom 10 or 20 years ago, is going to require learning how to learn online and learning how to curate and strategize around that educational process effectively for themselves. And so that's part of what our students need to learn while they are here with us so that they have a sustainable future in the field of engineering. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Susan, very much for those insightful comments, and it just rings so true. But I think maybe preaching to the choir here. But next, we're going to have a friend, a classmate, Daryl Wilson, who's the executive director of the Hydrogen Council. He sent us this video. It's about 10 minutes long, and it gives a bit of background about who he is and how he thinks about what we should be teaching. I think it's more about what he wishes we had taught him or he had learned when he went through the program. So if we could see the video now.
Hi, I'm Daryl Wilson. I'm a classmate of Professor Greg Evans. I know I look a lot older than he does, but I think that's probably just genetics. I want to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about my career experience over the last 40 years and reflect back on my time at U of T, where I was a graduate of the chemical engineering class of 1982, which is now surprisingly 40 years ago. I've had the privilege of working across many environmental and sustainable fields, starting my career with DeFasco and Hamilton as first head of safety and then head of health, safety, and environment. Then moved on to Toyota, where I used to make 1,000 cars a day and learned all kinds of operating discipline from my Japanese friends. Then a short assignment with a enhanced water treatment company, Xenon Environmental in Oakville. And then into the plastics and housing products industry with Royal Group Technologies and PVC. And then finally with Hydrogenics, a Canadian leader in electrolysis and fuel cell technology and hydrogen. For 13 years, the CEO there. And then after trying to retire, I wasn't very good at that and quit after a year. I've taken up this role as the Executive Director of the Hydrogen Council. So good to be with you. I apologize that I can't be with you in person. I know how much a big difference that makes, so I regret that we can't share this experience together today directly. I'm going to share 5 topics with you really quickly. What I should have learned, and they didn't really teach me when I was in engineering. We used to have a public speaking class, and that's probably as far as we got. A lot has changed, and phenomenal programming is now available to you within the U of T program. I hope this session encourages you to take advantage of what's now available to you and just maybe understand a little bit through my story what a difference it can make. Leadership is where I want to start. Leadership is an art that you learn over time. It's not a matter of being a leader. Anyone can become a leader. In fact, there is a roving course of leadership happening all the time. The official leader isn't always the leader. In fact, leadership is a practice discipline. It's a practice that you can start developing right now. There's all kinds of leadership opportunities in your class with the teams you work with, in the engineering society, throughout the campus, on sports teams and all the rest of it. But this is a soft skill that's absolutely important to have a sustainable career or work in the field of sustainability. I'm frankly not going to make much about working in sustainability as a field. I know everybody wants to do that today. But as you'll see, some of the things I learned in my career happened in some of the darker places where people don't normally want to go. But learning leadership through the exercise of all the traits that are required of leaders and developing that trust and inspiring the confidence of the people around you so that they will give you the gift of following you. That's a soft skill that you want to keep an eye on. And then teamwork. I know you work on projects and teams all the time. When I went through university, I had no idea how really the workplace is a continuous exercise in teamwork. The academic environment is actually completely artificial, where you kind of operate as a sole contributor, and hopefully you get good grades. Well, getting just to 80% isn't good enough in industry, and the way you get from 80% to 100% is through a team. Lots of talk about diversity these days, and I don't cast any dispersions on any of that, but frankly, learning to work with others and knowing who they are and knowing who you are is a skill that you're going to want to polish over your entire career. Because really, nothing of significance gets done by individuals working alone. And so teamwork is something that I realized after I left my engineering education was far more important than I ever realized. So yeah, we had a public speaking course. I remember Professor Reeves and the exercise of standing in front of my peers and shaking a little. Today, as communication skills are worked out in the program where you're at, I think you're getting a whole lot more than we got back then, as good a start as that was. Working in companies, in governments, throughout society, depends heavily on you getting your point across. And of course, listening to others more than half of the time, but your ability to engage your coworkers and to share your insights is really going to make a difference in your career. In fact, it's probably the biggest differentiator for those who end up doing well in the workplace. So polishing your communication skills now is critically important. I remember a friend of mine was the editor of the school newspaper there at U of T, and he nudged me to enter the public speaking competition as part of the engineering competition. I won that year, and I realized that because of my history and how I grew up, communication skills came somewhat naturally to me. But as I've polished those skills over my entire career, it's been a very, very critical asset. Just this week, I've been speaking in multiple conferences throughout Europe about hydrogen and the opportunity for decarbonization using hydrogen. At 63, it really feels good to be making the difference still that I'm making. And most of that difference making comes through the channel of just communicating well. So something to keep an eye on as well. And then here's one that I don't know if it's part of the program yet at U of T, but I think also really critical and a big gap. In my last assignment as a CEO, I was supported by a wonderful CTO, Joe Cargnelli, also a U of T grad for mechanical engineering. And as I watched Joe operate with customers, he just had a gift for listening, for understanding, and then putting his point across. Yeah, it was communication, but it was something else. Joe grew up around his father's machine shop. That machine shop had all kinds of customers, and Joe watched his dad and his uncle run that shop and grow the business, and realized that customers really are central to all of trade, of business. And the fundamental skill there is selling. When I graduated in 1982, there was a massive recession, the first really big downturn, and I had multiple job offers. Most of them evaporated. 2 of them remained. I went off to Hamilton to work for Dofasco, and 6 weeks later, they told me they were going to lay me off. I'll not be surprised that that's the experience that many of you have in the coming months and years. Don't worry about it. It was one of the best things that ever happened to me. There were no jobs around. Everybody was laying off, but there was a sales job. And I remember interviewing with the guy and having lunch and saying, I don't know if I really want to sell. And at that point, he was going to give me the job, and he said, no, maybe I won't give this guy the job. 3 weeks later, a little more humble, I came back and said, I think I'd really like that job. And I was on the road cold calling, selling hazardous industrial waste services for a company for the next year. And I got to tell you, my ability to act as a leader, to communicate, to run a company as a CEO turns really heavily on a bunch of skills that I learned that year selling on the road. Back in those days, the guys, women lower in the class were the ones who got the sales jobs, and I used to look down on that. But now I realize that commercial skills, commercial savvy is a really big part of business, and something you should never look down on. This last one's a little bit unique for those of you especially who are interested in the whole issue of sustainability. Getting things done in society means working at the interface between the public and the private sector. For most of my career, I've had lots to do with regulation, with environmental instruments that are developed by governments. And I've come to understand that if we're going to change our society for the better, it has to be a very, very strong partnership between the public and private sector. You're probably not getting exposed to how that whole system works. But it's something we're studying. So as you take up your career, pay attention to how your company or the enterprise that you're involved with interfaces with the government and regulation and laws and policy. In fact, connect your work with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And on this point, don't be too fussy where you work. I did my my undergraduate thesis on whiteware slips for toilets with the American Standard Company. I worked for the PVC industry, sometimes called the Satan of resins, the darkest place from an environmental point of view as part of the chlorine cycle. I'm sure many of you don't want to work for the oil and gas industry anymore. Maybe you want to reconsider some of those judgments. If we're going to get change happening, the oil and gas industry actually, as it transforms itself, has all of the skills and the project management capability to execute on large-scale energy projects. And some really positive and phenomenal things are happening. I'm not suggesting you go and work for the worst of the worst. But if I can say it this way, maybe you should reconsider as to whether you should work for the best of the worst. The second worst being, those companies, because they're working in the fossil fuel sector, the sector that's going out of vogue for all kinds of good reasons. There are things that you can learn there, and there are places you can contribute there and maybe transform society in a bigger way than you ever imagined. So be careful about the judgments you make around your next step. Maybe your options are going to be a bit restricted. and maybe you'll end up in a place that doesn't look too green to you. But as a friend of mine said to me when I entered working with the PVC industry, the darker it is, the greener you can make it. So be a difference maker in some of those dark places, and don't fret about what assignment you might get as a first assignment. Here's a last point. I'm thinking about you entering the workplace. I'm thinking back to my situation in 1982 with a big recession. Got married, moved off to Hamilton, had a 16% mortgage, and then got laid off. It sounds like kind of a bad way to start. But I look back on it now, and it taught me a lot of things. And later in my career, I came across this short expression, VUCA. The world and all that's going on is more and more volatile, and that makes us seasick as it goes up and down. And who knows what's going to happen? That uncertainty makes us a little bit anxious. And then there's nothing simple anymore. It's a complicated world, and that causes us confusion. And in the midst of all of this, we feel lost in the ambiguity. There seems to be nothing to hang on to. And the antidote for these things is to have a vision for what you want to be and where you want to go, and keep your eye on the horizon. Disregard all the volatility and ups and downs and stuff that's going on, and just keep your eye on the horizon of growing and being who you're made to be and making a difference. Have a vision. And then as you struggle with all that's going on and the uncertainty, work to understand it. Interact with your peers, the next generation, old guys like me, and work to understand what's going on and learn from all the trouble around you. And that will bring some clarity to all the complexity of what makes up the world, and gradually you'll find your way. And maybe the most important word of all is amid all that sense of lostness and the difficulty of getting going in today's world, the skills of agility, of being able to keep your eyes on the horizon, keep your eyes open, keep very high awareness and presence to what's going on, and then step by step to make the right moves with lots of wisdom. That's agility. And it's a skill that is critical for CEOs. It's a skill that's critical for you as you enter the workplace in the coming months. So I wish you all the best. Again, I'm sorry I couldn't be with you and chat and take your questions, but I hope some of this stuff has been helpful. Thanks very much.
Well, grateful that Daryl was at least be able to send us this video, and I will point out that one advantage of him sending the video is he pointed out the public speaking competition that he won. That is a jab that I've had to live with for 40 years because he actually beat me. And he put it on the video, and there's nothing I can do about it. So with that, I'll pass it on to DeAndre, who will share some thoughts about who engineering should be educating.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, so I think it just touched a little bit in some of what Susan said, and I think Greg spoke a little bit about preaching to the choir, but when I think about who we should be educating to, I think it's everyone. As someone who's studying engineering education, I think what we learn in engineering is very applicable to a lot of different things, especially sustainability. But obviously, and I think it was touched on a little bit in Daryl's video as well, when we think of diversity, there are certain groups that are underrepresented in engineering, and so they aren't reaping some of those benefits of an education in engineering, and their voices aren't at the table. And so, why is that important? And it's actually interesting because I've been following along through some of the panels today, and there was a fireside chat just before with the founder of Three Ships Beauty, and she was mentioning how sustainability is important to her business, and how she actually asked her customers, what does sustainability mean to you? And she got a number of different answers back. And so, when I think about why it's important for us to think of who is at the table when it comes to engineering education, sustainability can mean different things to different people. And Daryl touched on the UN SDGs. There's 17 SDGs, and they touch on a number of different topics. It's not just about energy and the environment, but there's an SDG related to education. There's an SDG related to inequities. There's an SDG related to gender equality, related to poverty, related to hunger. These are all aspects of sustainability that we need to keep in mind. And when we have these diverse voices at the table that can, add to this conversation, we can create a more robust, wholesome conversation about sustainability. Because when we think about engineering and engineering education, what it means to be an engineer can change based on who you are. Like, as for myself, so I grew up in the Bahamas. I was an international student when I studied engineering. And so when I think of sustainability, a lot of it is tied back to my experience in the Bahamas. I grew up every summer facing hurricanes. Most recently in 2019, one of the most devastating hurricanes that happened in the Bahamas, Hurricane Dorian. And so when I think about climate change, that's what comes to my mind. But someone who's from a completely different background will think of something else and will have different perspectives when it comes to sustainability. And so it's important that we're bringing those different voices to the table. Daryl touched on it too when he talked about teamwork and being able to work together with people from different backgrounds, different perspectives. I think that's an important aspect when we talk about engineering education. When I go back again to my personal experience, I worked in oil and gas. We're talking about oil and gas, the big bad. I won't say one way or another. I really enjoyed my experience working in oil and gas, but I was able to live and work in Fort McMurray for a significant amount of time. And, I saw the impact of tailings ponds taking up significant land space there and the impact that it had. I was able to work and do outreach with different Indigenous communities, had colleagues that, identified as Indigenous, and, just seeing the impact that it has on their homes, some of the things that we do. And it can be a controversial topic because there were many people that we worked with that actually were in favor of it as well, because again, it's not just about energy and the environment, but it's also about economic development as well. When we think about oil and gas and the economic impact and driver that it has, there's Indigenous communities that are actually in favor of it in that aspect. So we need to bring these different voices to the table in engineering. And I think, what we're doing in ISTEP here is that there's actually a number of initiatives that are, quite good at starting to bring that to the forefront. One of my colleagues in the audience, I won't specifically name him to throw him on the spot, but his research is looking at systems thinking. And there's a new course that was recently developed through iLead that's looking at solving what we talk about as wicked problems and bringing different perspectives to the table. These are some of the things that we need to teach our engineers, and we need different types of engineers, different people from different backgrounds in that conversation to be able to solve these quote-unquote wicked problems, because sustainability is a wicked problem. There's lots of different aspects to it that we need to touch on, that we need to understand. And when we bring those different voices to the table, they bring different perspectives. Going back to some of the Indigenous communities across Canada, or across what's currently known as Canada, when we think about this idea of net zero, Indigenous communities here and across the globe have been sort of living in net zero for forever. So, what can we learn when we bring them to the table? But how many Indigenous engineers do you know? I don't know that many, just a handful. For myself, as a Black woman in engineering, underrepresented, and I think about the concerns, again, going back to my home country of the Bahamas and other island nations that are predominantly Black, that would be impacted by climate change and rising ocean levels. Like, how many of us are at the table to talk about the solutions that will impact that? So, when we think about who we should be teaching in engineering, we really need to think about how are we making sure that we have these different people at the table. And even going a step further to that. And sorry, I don't know how much time do I have? Am I speaking too much? But, when Susan talked again about the how and how we teach, it's more than just what we teach. When we understand that the concepts that we're learning can have some sort of impact, it resonates more with us. But depending on your background, depending on where you come from, different things are going to resonate with you, right? Different things are going to be impactful to you. And so when we think about how we teach, we need to also think about who we're teaching because we can't design, engineering education that's impactful to different groups if we don't have those different groups at the table, and if we aren't thinking about what would be impactful to them. And then that leads me to just one more thing. So, in addition to who we teach, we need to think about who is teaching as well. And so, it's great to see, here at U of T and across other institutions taking an active look at, who are the professors that we have in engineering. Something that I find kind of interesting, actually, being an ISTEP, which is one of the things I really like about being an ISTEP, is that some of our professors aren't engineers at all. They're like drama background. I'm like, how did a drama professor get in engineering? But it actually goes back to some of what Daryl said too, like, this idea of being able to communicate in different ways and being able to, bring your point across is something that, maybe, an engineer that was taught in traditional engineering might not be best suited to teach, but someone who has studied drama might be able to teach us new generation engineers how to communicate in a different way. And so I think it's important to have, as well as, in the student body, having diversity as well in the teaching body. So, when we think about who we teach, we also should think about who is actually teaching as well.
Well, thank you very much. And I'll pick up on the point of who we want to have in the conversation, and we want all of you in the conversation. So we're going to turn it over to you in just a bit. I see some of you have been sending questions, sending chats, but as we ask questions, I also encourage you to submit your own answers as part of the chat. We're going to record this chat because we're looking for this input because we really want to have input on this topic from a wide range of people. So I encourage you to actively participate. If you prefer to speak up, be courageous. There are microphones here. The microphone won't bite you. It's okay to use. It's safe. Safe so far as I can see. So I encourage that. I'm going to lead off, and I'll ask one question to our panelists, and then we're going to open it up to you. And we've got a few questions in, I see. So I think we're good to go. So which one am I going to go with? Okay. We'll do the forward-thinking vision one. So imagine it's 2050. Our Faculty of Engineering is now being recognized for all the incredible work we did in educating engineers of the 21st century who are able to address sustainability. That's great. What we want to briefly hear is what we did. How did we make this transformation happen? So if you want to share some thoughts on that and see who's nodding more vigorously. Go ahead, Susan.
So that's a really difficult question. I told Greg I had no idea. If I knew, we would be doing that now. That said, there is a variety of reports and other work that has been done by the Carnegie Foundation and elsewhere about what the future of engineering education should look like in order to be impactful in the world. And one of the things that they point to is very much what Greg touched on around transdisciplinary learning, which is that idea of de-siloing technical courses from courses that have content that are related to communications, that are related to things like understanding economics, like understanding the humanities, understanding impact in the environment, and other types of sustainability, as DeAndre mentioned, not simply technical concerns. Because the difficulty we have, I think, in many engineering curricula, and in fact this is incentivized in some ways, is that we silo technical content from humanities courses and from humanities content. And so the connection, and I go back to what I said at the beginning, that concept of situated learning and being able to situate your technical expertise within a broader understanding of the world and the way in which that technical expertise comes to play with other types of expertise in wicked situations is lost when we do that. And so study after study, particularly the one by Sherry Shepard and the Carnegie Foundation, pointed to what they call a basket weaving type of curriculum that weaves different disciplines and particularly different competencies and skills into the technical curriculum. So if you think of the technical curriculum as being those spines, and then the content is woven in a way that is situationally appropriate to the content, and therefore makes the technical content more impactful. So I think we've done that to some degree in some of our courses in some areas by integrating communication, but I think there is way more we could do around integrating other types of skill sets that would allow that technical competency to become really supercharged for our graduates.
What a fabulous answer. So, DeAndre, you want to add some thoughts?
Everything Susan said.
Yes, Susan took all the easy ones.
But no, just to add a little bit to that, you know, a big part of what Susan said, but I think, you know, when I thought about this question, I think the big thing that, you know, if we looked to 2050, what would set U of T apart, or what would set, you know, an institution apart to educate that next generation of engineers is, I think it's the culture. And I'm going to give a little shout out to Corey and McCahan. I took their course last semester, which is EDI, Concepts in Engineering, but they talked a little bit about engineering mindsets, and, you know, similar to what Susan and what we had talked about quite a bit here is that, you know, this sort of old school engineering mindset is that engineering is so objective, and that the technical should be separate from everything else. But to Susan's point again, if we do want to solve these problems, we need to have them interwoven together. But it's more than just teaching it. I think it's also about showing it through the culture within this faculty. And I think, you know, as I mentioned before, in the types of professors that U of T is starting to hire now in engineering, we can see that they're starting to sort of walk the walk instead of just talk the talk. But really also, you know, continuing to foster that culture of inclusivity, foster that culture of collaboration, and showing that, you know, engineers are more than just these, you know, technical, I'm going to do all the problem solving equations, and you know, you have to be more holistic than that. You have to think about the social impact. You have to think about the broader wholesome impact, and you have to show that in how, not just how you teach the courses, but also how you structure the entire curriculum and how you create the entire student experience. So when I think about the engineer of 2050, I think about us shifting that culture.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think next we'll take a question online, and Quillian has agreed to be the voice of those online. So if you want to pick a question and fire it at us.
Yes, we have a good question here. How do we position students to become lifelong learners with online education, especially considering disparities in digital literacy?
Can you repeat the question just a bit?
How do we position students to become lifelong learners with online education, especially considering disparities in digital literacy?
I'm not catching the very end, especially considering the... the disparities in digital literacy. Yeah, which at least for our learners has reduced over the last 2 years, I think. You know, it's interesting to see from my perspective how many of our faculty are now interested in blending online learning with in-class learning in a much more seamless and deep way than they were pre-pandemic. I think pre-pandemic there was this real sort of activation energy barrier to teaching with digital technologies. There's, oh, I have to learn something new. Much of that has diminished. When we think about the broader sense of who is learning and how do we give access to people beyond our own learners at U of T, you know, I think that's a more complicated question, certainly. And there's a whole variety of people who are interested in particularly what's the next generation of MOOC technology. So massive open online courses, where are those going? The two of the bigger proponents in that space, edX and Coursera, which 7 years ago it was like everything was going to turn into MOOCs and we weren't going to have formal education anymore. That's largely gone away. Coursera is very much a now for-profit company. edX has just been bought up by a commercial platform, 2U, or is merged with a commercial platform. And yet, at the same time, the amount of content that's available to learners in this space has exploded, that's available for free to learners. But organizing and understanding that content, knowing what content is verifiable and high value, is, I think, an area where the university has a tremendous role to play of not just helping with the competency around the technology, but also the literacy around the information and the learning activities and resources that are available to people.
Everything Susan said. But no, I think in addition to that, I think learning how to learn, I think maybe Greg had mentioned that before, is going to be a big aspect of learning as a whole moving forward. Actually, I was recently on a talk with one of my colleagues from back in the Bahamas. She was speaking about sort of the digital revolution and how things are continuing to change so rapidly. And so really what we need to teach our learners is how to learn, because the next new digital platform is going to be out tomorrow, and then we'll have to learn how to use that one. It's not just about teaching someone how to use a very specific platform, it's teaching them how to almost teach themselves. And I think, in addition to that, when we go back to, the who is learning as well, making sure that we are considering accessibility and inclusivity in this as well. Making sure that when we are teaching these concepts of how to learn and what to learn, that we're taking into account that, different people from different backgrounds might be attempting to learn, and especially when we have online courses and we're looking at these like massive online virtual learning hybrid environments. There are people who learn better I personally prefer to be in person, who learn better in person. So, how do we continue to accommodate them? But, when we think about people who just can't be here in person, I think, again, going back to some of the indigenous communities or other rural communities, how are we making sure that they have access to these things? So, these are all of the things that we would need to consider when we look at, this continuous online learning. So it's not just about digital literacy of a specific platform, but learning how to learn and making sure that we're continuing to make that accessible to everyone.
Yeah, let me pick up on that and just really re-emphasize that point. If you walk away from our university and the education we provide and learn only one thing, is learning how to learn is the most important thing. And what we saw over the last 2 years teaching online, and we saw this from some of the surveys that you filled out, is that moving online divided the class. There were some students who could thrive in that sort of environment, some who got left behind. And one of the determinant factors is the extent to which they could be self-directed learners. And becoming a self-directed learner is the first step towards lifelong learning. The second factor is to how aware students are of their learning process, whether they feel that learning is something that happens or is done to them. They sit in the classroom and it happens by magic somehow, or something that they are consciously part of as well. And developing that metacognitive awareness is another important step. So I just want to point that out, and I'll put a plug in. We do have a final survey from the pandemic, which we're encouraging all undergraduates to fill out. So when you get the reminder notice tomorrow, please complete it. We really need those data. We'll pass it to the room. Are there any questions from the room? I see a hand up here. Do we have a microphone? Here, we got the microphone. Danny's coming down. He's fast as can be.
Hi, thanks a lot for the great discussions. Really enjoyed that. My question would be around, so we talked about multidisciplinary learning, and I agree that different disciplines have to sit together to learn together. But that's not happening. Our engineering students are taking separate courses from our humanities students from other disciplines, right? Is there a role to play at the university level when we do curriculum sort of management to make sure that different disciplines cross path or sort of overlap in certain courses so that engineering students sit together with humanities students and natural sciences students and they all learn together? Or, I mean, do we need to continue these siloed curriculum designs, or is there a way to look at the curriculum design at the university level and make sure multidisciplinary students learning together happens?
That's a great question for us to end on. I'm going to pass it to Susan. Do you want to try to tackle that? Because I think it's been a focal point.
In 10 seconds or less, because we're at the end of our session. I think actually timetabling, of course, is one of the huge physical obstacles to this. Because trying to find spots for humanities courses for engineers means that they're often grouped together into individual sections. I'm actually, we're looking at whether or not introducing options around online learning for students in some courses, not for the majority of the courses, but for some courses, therefore creates more flexibility in the timetable to actually allow for more mixing and a more flexible timetable for that kind of interaction. But it's complicated.
Well, in closing, I want to certainly thank our panelists for their wonderful comments. I want to thank you all for your input. I'm looking forward to reading what was on the chat to get some more ideas. And I'll say that our faculty is about to develop our academic plan for the next 5 years, so we appreciate you sharing your thoughts, because everything that you say can help us shape our thinking as to where we should be 5 years from now and in 2050. Thank you very much for coming.